Okay, so there are 25 inverse tangent functions that you guys that are possible on the unit circle. These are 6 of them. You had a handout with them. They're in your notebook, and I've given you like several assignments with some random ones in there. So you should be able to answer these kinds of questions. So cosine inverse of 1/2, and when you see arc or you see the inverse function, that's referring to that 1-to-1 piece. So for cosine inverse of 1/2, it would be pi over 3. For sine inverse of -1, remember sine, when it's a negative ratio, you have to give the negative angle. So it'd be negative pi over 2, not 3 pi over 2, even though they both give you a -1. But for the 1-to-1, this is what the one they're looking for. Tangent inverse of 0, that means that y is 0 and x is 1 because it's y over x. So it's going to be 0. Arc cosine of negative radical 2 over 2, that when arc cosine is negative, that means it's in quadrant 2, so that's going to be 3 pi over 4. Okay, arc sine of negative radical 3 over 2, that's going to be negative pi over 3. Okay, and arc tangent of radical 3. Remember, this comes from radical 3 over 1, which is radical 3 over 2, like that. So it's pi over 3. So I asked you for a lot of pi over 3s. Okay, so that's this part. Okay, so compositions like this one, like these here, where they're inverses of each other, like sine, sine inverse, cosine, cosine inverse, tangent, arc tangent, or tangent inverse. As long as the number for sine and cosine, as long as the number here is between -1 and 1 inclusive, then your answer would be that number itself. So -2/3 is between -1 and 1, so the answer is -2/3. Number 8, 2 is not between -1 and 1. So actually this part of it doesn't even exist. So this one would be no solution. Okay, cos number 9, this number is between -1 and 1, so that's your answer. Okay, and for tangent, it's a different story. As long as this is a real number, then that's the answer when you have tangent, arc tangent. Okay, so now 11 through 13 is the other order, where you have the inverse on the outside and the function on the inside. So with these, you have to keep track of the 1-to-1 piece, okay, for sine, cosine, and tangent. So for sine, the 1-to-1 piece was between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So as long as this number is doing that, then you're good. That's the answer, pi over 7. Okay? If it's not, then like number 12, for example, the 1-to-1 piece for cosine is between 0 and pi, and this is bigger than that. So for this problem like this, you have to do a little bit more work. You have to first evaluate the inside. So cosine of 7 pi over 4 would be, let's see, it's in quadrant 4, so it's going to be positive radical 2 over 2. And so now we find cosine inverse of radical 2 over 2. That would be pi over 4. That would be the answer. For tangent inverse of tangent of negative pi over 9, just like with sine, the 1-to-1 piece is between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, but this doesn't include the endpoints, right? But negative pi over 9 is within that range. So we have negative pi over 9 as our answer. So when the number here is not where it's supposed to be, then you evaluate it. You evaluate the function like we did for number 12, and then you find the angle that is within the 1 to 1, like we did here where pi over 4 instead of 7 pi over 4. Okay, that's how you do these type of problems. Alright, so for these problems you need to make sure that you are in radian mode. Okay, and so we're looking for the angle that gives us these ratios right here. These are all ratios, okay, the ones in part of the problem. The answers are angles in radian mode. So basically you just hit second function or shift function. For number 14 it's tangent, and then 7.5. The answer is 1.438. Okay, so this is the angle in radian mode. Okay, this is the ratio. So the same will be true for the rest of them. Okay, so sine inverse of negative 0.236 would be negative 238. Arc sine, same thing, arc sine is the same as sine inverse, so arc sine is shift sine of 0.725, and that would be 0.811. And then cosine inverse, so shift cosine of negative 0.446, that's going to be 2.033. So the calculator gives you the answer in the proper quadrants, because it knows that for cosine, when it's a negative ratio, the angle would be in quadrant 2. When sine, when it's in a negative ratio, it's in quadrant 4, but in the negative direction. Okay, so it's programmed that way. If it's a fraction, if they give you the ratio as a fraction, let's say sine inverse of negative 3 pi over 7, you and I've been putting equal, but they're all approximations. Don't forget your parentheses, because if you don't, it's going to tell you that it's an error and you're going to think that it doesn't exist. Okay, if you put it in without parentheses, so you need parentheses. So that would be inverse sine, left parenthesis, negative 3 divided by 7, close parentheses, and that is negative 0.443. Okay, so now these type of problems, remember, anytime you see the inverse or arc in front of the trig functions, that represents an angle. We'll call it theta. So our final answer to this problem is the sine of theta. So it's going to be a ratio. The answer is a ratio. Tangent inverse of 5/4 would be here. So remember, tangent is y over x. So 5 and 4 goes here. To get the r value, r is the square root of 5 squared plus 4 squared. So that's 25 plus 16. So that's going to give you square root of 41. Okay, and it's a prime number, so nothing comes out. It stays as square root of 41. And then we want the sine of this angle. Okay, this is theta. The sine is y over x. So it's going to be y over r. 5 over radical 41. We rationalize it and get 5 radical 41 over 41. Okay, so for number 20, same thing. There's arc sine, so we know that this is an angle. The ratio is negative, so we know that it's in quadrant 4 for sine, so we draw it right there. Okay, and sine is y over r, so it's going to be negative 3 8. So x is the square root of 6 or 8 squared minus negative 3 squared. So it's 64 minus 9. So that's, well, square root. And it's going to be square root of 55. Okay, and again, square root of 55, it's not a prime number, but no, it doesn't have a square factor, so there's nothing that comes out. So this is going to be square root of 55. Secant is a reciprocal of cosine, so it's going to be r over x. So 8 over radical 55, rationalize 8 radical 55 over 55.